If you have your Bibles, turn with me to 1 Samuel chapter 1. 1 Samuel chapter 1, beginning a study of Samuel this morning, who is both a judge over Israel and prophet. However, we're not going to focus as much on Samuel this morning as we are his mother, Hannah. Question as we begin our study this morning: how important are mothers? Very important. Well, without mothers, where would we be this morning? We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be here without mothers. As individuals, how important are our mothers to us? Or how important were they if they passed?
She was the best mother in the world.
And that's...
I draw strength from her still. She's been gone a long time.
So we all have this close, we all love our mothers. And, as children, you think about the place that a mother has in the life of her children. Let me give you some quotes from some figures from history you're all going to be very familiar with. From Napoleon Bonaparte, and we're very familiar with Napoleon. He said, "Let France have good mothers, and she will have good sons." John Quincy Adams said, "All that I am, my mother made me." Talking about the influence that his mother had on his life. And then Abraham Lincoln. And again, notice this, these three quotes, two of them were presidents of our great country. But Lincoln said, "All that I am or hope to be, I owe to my angel mother." As children, we owe a lot to our parents. We owe a lot to our fathers, but we also owe a lot to our mothers, do we not? You think about all that our mothers did for us. They fed us, they changed our diapers, they took care of us when we were sick. And in many cases, they do a lot more than what we see them do. And we understand that the roles of men and women are different, but let us not be mistaken. How vital are women and mothers in the home and the rearing of children?
Most of the time, they're the most important influence.
That's a good point, Dusty, as we're going to see here in just a moment. You think about the woman depicted in Proverbs chapter 31, that virtuous woman. That's the kind of woman that all women should desire to be, is it not? She has a good family. She is industrious. But above all, she is godly, is she not? That godly woman. And then you come to the New Testament. You think about some of the great passages on regarding women and mothers. 1 Timothy 5, verse 14, they guide the house. And Titus tells us in Titus chapter 2, verse 4, that they are to love their children. And of course, part of this love involves discipline in teaching. And mothers have a tremendous influence on their children, but not just mothers. Let's also add grandmothers to the mix as well. Mothers and grandmothers have a tremendous influence on their children or grandchildren, and we understand it can be either for good or for bad. Are there instances in the scriptures where there were mothers and grandmothers who had a negative influence on their children?
We're not told anything that I can think of, but I can't imagine that Jezebel would have been a good...
That's Jezebel. Jezebel.
Wasn't there another one during the time of the kings that had a young son that she influenced?
Yeah, Athaliah. In fact, Athaliah worked behind the scenes so much she wanted the throne to herself. In fact, there came to a point, and I may be wrong on this. I'm just going off the top of my head, and I haven't studied this in a little bit. But there was a point where she wanted to put her own grandson to death so she could ascend to the throne. So So you're exactly right. Keith points out Jezebel, and we understand what kind of lady she was. And we're very familiar with what happened with Naboth's vineyard. Ahab tried to get it. And I find that account interesting because Naboth kept telling Ahab no, and Ahab went home and laid on his bed and pouted. He turned his back, and then his wife, Jezebel, came in and asked him, "What's wrong?" And he told her, and so, if anything, she was more decisive and was more apt to do things than Ahab was. Where Ahab wanted to whine, Jezebel was going to go have a man murdered for her husband. But those are two examples of negative motherhood, But we have many examples of positive motherhood in the Bible, such as Ruth and Naomi, Lois and Eunice in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and chapter 3. From a child, Paul talked about in verse 15 there how he had known the scriptures. And so that involved teaching. So we know nothing of Timothy's dad. Obviously, it's implied he was not a godly man or he was not there. So who took it upon themselves to teach Timothy? Lois and Eunice, his mother and his grandmother. Mary. That's another good example, Sister Ruby. But sadly, how is motherhood viewed today? As a chore, as a burden. There are many women who view motherhood as a burden. And as a result, they're unwilling to accept the responsibilities presented by motherhood. However, it's my personal conviction that, perhaps there's no woman in the Bible as compelling to study as that of Hannah. And so as we look to 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2, we're gonna find a great woman. Because she lived during a turbulent period in the history of Israel, the time of the judges. And this was a time in which men did that which was right in their own eyes, according to Judges 21, verse 25. And even during the time which she lived here in now, we find that the religious leaders had corrupted themselves. And you look at chapter 2 in verse number 12 here in 1 Samuel, we're told that the sons of Eli, who was the priest, were sons of Belial, and that they knew not the Lord. So this tells me that Eli failed as a father, did he not? He was in a very important position as a religious leader in Israel. And what happened to his sons? Were they brought up in the ways of the Lord? They weren't directed. And that's a sad statement, is it not, in chapter 2 and verse number 12? However, little did Hannah know she would come to bring forth a son who would make a difference in Israel. A son who would be a godly influence for an ungodly culture. And yet, as we are going to study this morning, this is the type of child she desired, and that she wanted to raise one who respected, obeyed, and served the Lord. So the question this morning is this: what kind of a mother was Hannah? A good one. That's about as succinct as you can put it, Sister Ruby. A good one. And certainly she is the kind of mother our homes and families and our society needs today. And certainly she was a mother who resolved to give her son to the Lord, and we're going to find out that she did fulfill her promise to dedicate her child to the Lord. And so this morning, as we begin our study of Samuel, and this morning we're going to look especially at motherhood, godly motherhood. The mother of Samuel, Hannah. She is the mother who dedicated her son to the Lord. And we're going to introduce our study by looking at these two chapters and finding out what God has to say about the character of Hannah, which will explain to us what made Samuel such a godly individual. And we're going to see in this study the impact that godly mothers can and do have on their children. Because as we understand, Samuel became a great godly man and a leader in Israel as both a judge and prophet because of the faith of his mother, the faith she demonstrated in God through the avenue of prayer, and her faithfully fulfilling the vow she made prior to Samuel's birth. And of course, her example stresses the importance of godly motherhood today. And her example shows that it can be done. And certainly, as you ladies can attest to this morning, who have raised your children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So as we get into our study, let's first of all look at Hannah's introduction in chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Verses 1 and 2, we see her relation. She was married to a man by the name of Elkanah, who was the son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. And he had 2 wives. The name of the one was Hannah, and the name of the other Peninnah. And again, we understand polygamy in the Bible. We see it in the Old Testament, but yet Christ had said in the New that from the beginning that this thing was not so. It was never God's intent for this situation to take place. Nevertheless, we see it happening here. But yet you look at the misery it brought. Because you find Hannah's situation here in verse number 2. She had no children. Now, what did Peninnah have that Hannah did not? Children. So how do you think Hannah felt, having to live in a house or living in a home where she had no children, but yet Peninnah had children? Felt inferior. And you think about this here in verse number 2, there's this sense of disdain. In my study, I found that one reason as to why Elkanah had 2 wives was due to her being barren, that she could not bring forth a child. In Jewish culture, barrenness was considered to be a disgrace. Now, that's sad, is it not? But that's the way the culture was during this time. Women who could not bring forth a child was considered to be a disgrace.
That was like carry on the family name, it's like work in the fields.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what it did Deuteronomy when Moses was talking about the law, one of the promises he made was that they would all bear, their cattle would bear, their sheep would bear, their wives would bear, they wouldn't be barren.
I believe so. But again, that does not mean God would circumvent, certain things. Because, the same situation is true today. There are women, countless numbers of women today who desire to have children, but cannot, through no fault of their own. And certainly this was no fault of Hannah that she couldn't bear children. So, seeking to be blessed with children, Elkanah married another woman. It is plausible, we're going to find here in the text, it's plausible that Elkanah had married Hannah first, then married Peninnah after finding out that Hannah was barren. And we're going to find out here in a moment just how Peninnah used this to antagonize Hannah. Now, understanding this background, we find in verses 3 through 5 that Elkanah was a godly man. Because we're told in verse 3, he went up out of his city yearly to worship, to sacrifice unto the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And so verse 3, we have this declaration. And this particular feast was probably the Feast of Tabernacles, according to Exodus chapter 13 and verse number 10. As we think about the meal that is talked about here in this text, that after he had offered, he gave to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and her daughters portions, and to Hannah had given a worthy portion. Burton Kaufman in his commentary notes that the sacrificial meal which Elkanah's household enjoyed at Shiloh was evidently a peace offering. Worshippers were permitted to feast on the peace offerings after the priests had taken their portion, and the event mentioned here was that of parceling out the food to individuals. And so you think about the parceling out here. We find in verse 4 that Peninnah and hers and the sons and daughters were given their portions, but unto Hannah she received a worthy portion. Literally, this means a double portion. Now, why would Elkanah do that? That's exactly right, Dusty. Verse number 5. For he loved Hannah. So this phrase, what does this phrase tell us about Elkanah and Hannah?
Good relationship.
Good relationship. No doubt he had strong feelings for her. I don't think there's any question there. So he was devoted to her. However, though, in this same verse, we see her consternation. But the Lord had shut up her womb. It's the idea of just, as we pointed out, she was bearing. Now look at verses 6 and 7. Look at how Peninnah is described here as being Hannah's what? Verse 6? Adversary. So when you think about an adversary, what comes to mind? What's that? Enemy. A rival. Someone who's against you. And so notice what is said here about her. Peninnah provoked her sore for to make her fret. So she made sure that she was going to needle Hannah every chance she got, didn't she? Can you imagine the pain Hannah had to have felt, having to deal with the fact that she was barren, but then having it thrown up in her face?
Yes, because girls can be very mean. They can take it from experience in school. Girls can be very mean.
And
I think that Peninnah maybe felt neglected, or she had children, but
yeah,
she could have been jealous of her.
could have been too. That's another excellent point, Sister Nana.
Well, another example of this is Rachel and Leah,
Yep.
sister.
That's another good point, Sister Ruby. Leah could have the children. Rachel could not, but Jacob loved Rachel. So there was that rivalry there too. So just as we see it here. And it's noted that, Peninnah would, at home at worship, she showed her hatred for Hannah, persecuting her as much as she could. Hence, it's little wonder that Hannah, wept. Year by year, when she went up to the house of God, she was provoked, and she wept and did not eat. However, what did Elkanah do? Did he just sit by and, without being concerned for Hannah's condition? Tried to comfort her. Verse number 8. And he asked her, why are you crying? Why are you not eating? Why is your heart grieved? Now, what do you think he meant by this? Am not I better to thee than 10 sons? What do you think he's meaning by that statement? Gave to her and he loved her. Exactly.
He knew how much trouble she wanted a child.
And so he's trying to make her feel better. He's really saying he could do more for her than 10 sons. I can provide for you, Hannah. Why are you crying? Why are you fretful? I love you, and I can do much for you. But it's interesting. Who did Hannah turn to in this time of grief? God. She knew her husband loved her, but what else did she know? Or what else did she recognize? God could help her. And that's the attitude we all need to have today, is it not? Is that God can help us. And so she took her burden to God in prayer. And isn't that the same thing we need to do today as His people? Is when we're burdened, cast all of our cares upon Him, for He cares for us. 1 Peter 5, verse number 7. And that's exactly what she does, verses 9 through 18. And let's look at this beautiful petition here. In verse number 10, we see she was in bitterness of soul, and she wept sore. And obviously, she was hurting emotionally, was she not? She was hurting mentally. And so she's going to pour out her heart unto God, and that's what she does. As we pointed out, she takes her troubles to the Lord. But not only that, she prayed in accordance to the will of God, verse number 10, unto the Lord. She made a request of the Lord, and what was that request? According to verse number 11.
They would give her son and she would devote him back to her.
She made a request, but she also made a vow. If you bless me with a son, I will give him to you. So she didn't just pray for a son, did she? She prayed for a son so that she could do what? Give it to God. This is so from these words, what kind of woman is Hannah? We're finding out. What kind of woman is she? Faithful woman. And so she's a woman that all women should emulate as far as her faith goes, is she not?
You know, I used to cry when I'd read out every year she made him a little coat and took to him, and I thought that was so sad because I could just imagine a mother seeing her son once a year and taking him that little coat as he was growing, and yet she wasn't with him to see all of the little developmental stages that he went through. To me, that was always kind of sad.
That would be sad, but also in a sense, she was glad because she knew what kind of.
She was keeping her promise.
But she was raising a godly son in that regard.
And she turned him over
To the Lord.
to Eli. To teach him and bring him up about it. Yeah, I know that, but I was still as a mother.
Obviously, no doubt, it would be hard on her. But again, her faith led her to making this vow, and her faith led her to keeping this vow. A great demonstration of faith.
What's the significance of the no razor coming upon his head?
Not Nazarite vow. See it in the book of Judges with Samson was a Nazarite.
Nothing great, any wine or any.
No, it's they were very specific in their requirements. And we'll probably come back and study more about that later on, but that's a Nazarite vow made. So just as Samson was a Nazarite, so too here is Samuel a Nazarite in that regard.
But they didn't have to be a Nazarite.
No, they didn't have to. No.
It could be a certain period.
Right. There was a way in which the vow could end. There was a specific offering that was to be made when that vow was ended. And, so that helped a little bit, Cindy?
Well, wasn't there a law that the first male child was to be dedicated? I'm trying to remember some of the things.
No.
There was
No specific law. No, so Hannah did this of her own free will, which makes this more amazing. Because there was no law specifically stated you got to give your son over to the Lord, your firstborn son. No, this was free will, which again demonstrates the great faith that Hannah had. But not only did she pray, what does verse 12 tell us about her praying?
Okay.
What's that?
It happened. Verse 12.
Eli saw her praying.
Well, Eli, but there's one word in here that I think is very important for us as we think about, especially as we relate to prayer. Continue. So she not only prayed, but she did what in prayer? Continued. So she was persistent in prayer. When we pray today, how should our prayers be? Persistent. And that's what Christ taught in Luke 18 in the parable of the unjust judge and the persistent widow. And as well as in Luke 11 with the parable of the friend at midnight. You don't just pray. You keep on praying. And that's what Hannah did here. She was observed by Eli. The idea of marked here is the concept of observing or looking upon. Now, where did her prayer come from? From the heart. So this was thought out. This wasn't just random. She was putting her full heart, the totality of her being into this prayer, and hence she was very sincere, no doubt about that. Now look at verses 14 and following. How Eli saw her, and what was his mistaken assumption?
He thought she was drunk on wine.
He thought she was drunk. And he asked her, how long are you going to be drunk? Put away the wine from thee. And so he is judging according to appearance. He made a mistaken assumption. And so he chastised her wrongly. Notice what Hannah said, verse 15 and 16. She tells him, no, I'm a woman of sorrowful spirit. I've drunk neither wine or strong drink. I've poured out my soul before the Lord. So you don't count me as a daughter of Belial, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief have I spoken hitherto. And so Eli blesses her. Verse 17 tells her, go in peace. Really, he's admitting here his mistake in assuming she was drunk. And so here he simply asks God to relieve her of her sorrow. Hannah's response, verse 18, was to be thought of more worthily. Let thine handmaid find grace in thy sight. And so she went her way and did eat, and her countenance was no more sad. And why do you think it was no more sad? Trusted God. She trusted God had heard her prayer and would answer it. Hence, let's look now, verses 19 and following. We're going to find that Hannah was indeed blessed with a son. They returned. Verse number 19, rose up early in the morning, worshiped God, and returned home. But in this same verse, we're told they came to Ramah. And what does it say about God here? He remembered her. So God heard her prayer, and He answers her prayer. So how was she rewarded here? Verse number 20. She conceived and bare a son, and called his name Samuel. What do you think the name Samuel means?
Name of God.
What's that?
Name of God.
That's asked or heard of God. So we see again, why pray? Because God hears prayers and God answers prayers. I suppose we all look, we take a little side trip here. A lot of people mocked those, did they not this week, who wanted to offer up prayer for the victims of the massacre? And you understand the basic thrust was they said, well, prayer's nothing. Is prayer nothing?
To them it isn't, but it isn't, but if they know the Lord, they know that they got.
Prayer is something.
They gotta talk to Him.
So how valuable is prayer to us?
Is there hope?
Communication.
Communication. And
It's our lifeline.
That's right.
Ephesians 6:18 talks about that. Prayer is powerful. And not only that, it's powerful because God hears prayer, God answers prayer. And again, sometimes not in the way we want. But this incident here, Hannah had her prayer heard by God and answered. So that tells me the ears of the Lord are open. And He wants us to pray, does He not? And so this is a great point of application for us all. Should we not have that praying spirit that Hannah had? When we are burdened in our spirits, when we are troubled, when we are sorrowful, what should we do? Pray. It isn't any trouble, as I sing with the kids here. It isn't any trouble just to P-R-A-Y, pray. It doesn't take much just to stop and pray, does it? We need to take advantage of this great of this great avenue, just as Hannah did, and she was rewarded for it. Verses 21 through 28, we have the actual fulfillment of her vow, Hannah's dedication of Samuel. Verse 21, Elkanah and all his house, he returned year by year to Shiloh to make the sacrifice. But again, verse 22, we see that Hannah refused to go, and she tells him why. I will not go up until the child be weaned or brought to age. And then I will go up. However, when she went back to Shiloh, what would be the purpose for her? To leave the child with the Lord, to give him to the Lord forever in lifelong service. Elkanah responded in verse number 23 by telling her, do what seemeth thee good, tarry until thou hast weaned him. Only the Lord establish his word. Elkanah here is saying, the Lord shall fulfill his promises and designs. His will shall be accomplished. And so again, we are seeing in the midst of this, not just great faith on the part of Hannah, but I believe we're seeing faith on the part of Elkanah, are we not? In all of this. However, verses 24 through 28, we're told that when she weaned him, she took him up with her, with 3 bullocks, 1 ephah of flour, and a bottle of wine, and brought him unto the house of the Lord in Shiloh. And the child was young. So he's very little when she brought him up here. And here they offered up sacrifice unto God. She worshiped God. And then in the latter portion of verse 25, she presents him to Eli. Now, if you're Eli, you're probably thinking, what is going on here? What is this woman doing? But what does she tell him? Verse 26. What does Hannah tell Eli here?
She reminds him that she was the woman that was praying for this child.
Mm-hmm.
And that the prayer was granted, and she's keeping her promise to the Lord.
Mm-hmm. God granted her prayer. God answered her prayer. And so she's keeping her promise, as you pointed out, Dusty. And again, that's a great example for us. We live in a day and age in which promises are made and broken every single day, are they not? But Hannah here makes a promise and keeps it, just as God makes and keeps his promises. In verse 28, she tells him, she demonstrates her faith in God. Therefore, also as I have lent him to the Lord, as long as he liveth, he shall be lent to the Lord. And he worshiped the Lord there. In other words, she's saying, I've made a vow. Because I trust God, I'm going to keep my vow. And I'm going to do as I said. I promised I would lend him to God, and now I am going to lend him to God. We can lend our children to God today, do we not? Not in this specific instance where we leave them at a specific place, but do we not lend them to God by bringing them up in the ways of God? Teaching them to respect and obey God from an early age. And it's a challenge, obviously. But we see the rewards for doing such. Then you come to chapter 2, and as we look at this beautiful section of Scripture. A beautiful song from Hannah. Look at her proclamation, verses 1 through 10. Really, this is a hymn of thanksgiving. In all of this, Hannah gives praise to God. And she demonstrates her thankfulness to God for blessing her with Samuel. Look at verse number 1. Look at her joy. Where was her joy at? In the Lord. And certainly our joy is in God, in the Lord today, is it not? And we should we be joyful as God's people today? Indeed, there is joy to living the Christian life. And we should be joyful that we can be Christians. In fact, joy is a part of the fruit of the Spirit there in Galatians 5:22 and 23. And that thus joy should be manifest in our life. But what was the sphere of this joy? What did it encompass? Her whole life, the totality of her being. That's exactly right, Dusty. And not only was her joy in the Lord, not only did it encompass her entire being, but God provided her with strength and vigor. And that's the idea of her horn being exalted here. It signifies inward joy, which is accompanied and occasioned by the changed circumstances of her outward lot, according to the pulpit commentary. Wiersbe, in his Bible exposition commentary, noted that to have your horn exalted meant to receive new strength from God and be especially helped by Him at a time of crisis. And certainly we see how Hannah's horn was exalted. God had blessed her with a child, with a promised son, the son she prayed for. And then she praised God. She says, "My mouth is enlarged over mine enemies because I rejoice in thy salvation." The idea here of her mouth enlarged is not for cursing or bitterness, but for joyful praise of God. And I like the phrase, "I rejoice in thy salvation." And again, as we think about some applications for today from that phrase, there's the fact we're saved from sin's a great cause for joy, is it not? Isn't it, if you cannot find anything to be joyful about in this world as a Christian, cannot salvation be a good enough reason to be joyful? Indeed so. Now, verses 2 through 10, not only do we see her joy, but she recognizes God. But not only she recognizes God, she recognizes who He is and His power. Verse number 2, she recognizes the nature of God. And again, this is a lot of powerful lessons that Hannah can teach us. And here she recognizes there is none holy as the Lord, there is none beside thee. Neither is there any rock like our Lord. He is our strength. He is our refuge. And He is the source of all comfort, and He's the one we need to turn to. She talks about His superiority in verse number 3. And then she goes on in verses 4 through 10 to proclaim His almighty power. It's a marvelous, marvelous song of praise unto God. And we could spend a whole class time talking about these 10 verses. However, let's look now at verse 11, as well as verses 18 through 21, and then verse 26, Hannah's devotion. And look at Samuel, first of all, verse number 11. After she spoke this song, after she sang this song, the hardest part came. And that hard part was leaving her son there, was it not? Would you not think so? Because they're told they went to Ramah, Elkanah went to Ramah to his house. But what did Samuel do? Stayed there and ministered unto the Lord before the priest. It is noted that certain duties were allotted to him to perform suited at his age, but few at first, but increasing in importance as time went on, for the words refer to the whole period of his service. And again, there's some great applications for today. When children obey the gospel, get them to work immediately, doing things for God. There's little things you can do for, girls. There's things you can do for boys. I remember when I obeyed the gospel, a week or so later, they put me to work waiting on the table. I didn't have to say a prayer, but I was on my home congregation. They gave on the outside. They showed me what to do. The older men did. They showed, here's how you pass this out. So they put me to work early, and as I grew, as I matured, more things were put upon me, like leading prayers or even announcements. But, that's the importance of getting an early start. Again, it's interesting to note as well, and time is quickly running out, but very briefly, it's interesting to note the powerful and positive influence Hannah had on her son in dedicating him to the Lord as compared to Eli's lack of fatherly influence, whose sons were corrupt and refused to obey God. Verses 12 through 17. And again, you go back to the example of Timothy. We're not told anything about his father, but we're told what Lois and Eunice did for him. Trained him in the ways of God. So women, mothers, you have a profound impact in shaping your children. Never forget that. However, as we talked about earlier, even though Hannah left him there, she still came year by year. She still demonstrated her love for her son through visits and by making him garments each year. And as a result, she was blessed for her faith in God. And as we close, I think this is important. Verse 20. Perhaps one of the most encouraging things for Hannah. What does Eli tell Elkanah and Hannah in verse number 20? As we close this lesson here in chapter 2. What blessing is pronounced upon them?
The Lord will give you descendants for the line of that one.
Mm-hmm.
And give them over.
Again, I'm reminded of what was said in Acts 20:35. Christ said it's more blessed to give than to receive. But if you give back to God, what's God? You're going to receive blessings from God. So what did Hannah receive from God according to verse 21?
3 sons and 2 daughters.
Her faith was rewarded, was it not? Hannah, there's one of the greatest demonstrations of motherhood in the Bible, in my opinion. Her attitude affirms to us motherhood's desirable. Her actions affirm to us that motherhood is a great privilege. And you think about this as we close. When mothers' hearts are attuned to God's will, they will find themselves fulfilled in their very special role God has blessed them with. They will recognize the impact they are having in the lives of their children in society. Look at Hannah's godly influence in the life of her son. He would grow in stature and in favor with men and with God, just as Christ did. Chapter 3, verses 19 and 20. Mothers do make a positive and powerful influence for good when they set their hearts on God and resolve to give their children to the Lord God. Ladies, mothers here this morning, thank you for your godly service. And I hope that this study this morning has encouraged you and strengthened your faith in the God that we serve.